Hi students, Professor Matt here. Today's lecture is going to focus on Marxist or materialist analysis. Now, I know some of you are thinking, if I apply Marxist analysis to literature, does that mean that I'm a communist or a socialist? And the short answer to that question is no, it does not. Now, of course, the term Marxist does come from Karl Marx, the German philosopher, economist, sociologist, who was certainly a socialist. However, we are looking at Marxist theory for how it can be applied to hermeneutics. And so hermeneutics is the art of interpretation. So we're looking at how we can use Marxist ideas to interpret literature. And of course, if that word Marxist is offensive, you can always use the word materialist analysis. So a brief overview. Some of what Marx gave us here in his writings and his philosophy was looking at how society is organized into different social classes. And so we can look at three distinct types of social classes for our society. We have the aristocracy, which would represent the upper class. We have the bourgeoisie, which is the middle class, and the proletariat, which would be the working class. We also have the tension between a capitalist society and a socialist society. And I won't go into all the details of those two systems, but suffice it to say that a capitalist society favors an unequal distribution of wealth versus a socialist society which looks at equality of wealth spreading through its population. And capitalism also encourages private ownership of property, whereas socialism looks at the state being the owner of property. And so we'll think about primarily the way in which wealth is a factor in the various social classes. Now, materialist analysis looks at how material conditions of our existence, so our housing, our work environment, our access to education and healthcare, etc., are directly affect the quality of our life. So that if we tend to have a lot of money, right, if we come from the aristocracy or the middle class, we tend to have greater access to better housing, better work environments, education, healthcare, etc. And if we come from a working class or come from poverty, then our access to these very basic things might be inhibited in the way that they're not if we have greater socioeconomic clout. Now, key to a Marxist philosophy is the idea of ideology. And ideology is a set of beliefs. It's a belief system. And there can be debate about whether these beliefs are conscious or not. For our purposes, we're going to say ideology includes both conscious beliefs as well as those which haven't been entirely thought through. So they might be what we would call pre-conscious. That is, we're capable of articulating these ideologies that we haven't fully thought about, but yet we do use them to think about and interpret our world. Now, one critic said that ideologies, or these belief systems, conflate holding a point of view with knowing the truth. And I really liked that quote because I do believe it gets right to the heart of what ideologies do, is that it gives us a way of interpreting the world and naturalizing the world so that we think, reality is not just the way it appears to me, but the way it actually is. And we don't realize some of these belief systems, some of these ideologies, until we encounter people who have different sets of beliefs, right? And our knee-jerk reaction to that might be, oh, your beliefs are strange and weird and inferior to mine. My beliefs are clearly much better than yours. Right? And that's when you know you're butting up against ideologies, right? These sort of deeply held beliefs that are ways of interpreting the world, of which we might be partially conscious or not, and we don't really know about it until we encounter different sets of beliefs. Now, ideologies do help create social roles. They tell us how to act when we are in certain social situations, and they can make these social relationships appear natural, and they can also help to perpetuate and justify certain economic relationships. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, the idea of bourgeois ideology are the ideas that have allowed the middle class to flourish over the last 100 years or so. The idea of a Protestant work ethic, the idea that the family is an important part of the social organization, and certainly certain codes of moral behavior, right, that are all tied up to middle-class ideologies. And the idea is that what makes it ideological is we assume that these are the best ideas for all classes and all circumstances and in all historical times, rather than thinking, this is perhaps one way of doing things that exists right now and that this might change, it might evolve in some way, and not that history has kind of progressively led us up to this point. Now, one good example of how ideologies can circulate are Horatio Alger stories, which were an author who wrote these stories, they're sort of juvenile novels in which the protagonist came from poverty and through hard work and dedication and a little bit of luck was able to obtain middle-class respectability. And so Horatio Alger stories are what we might commonly call bootstrap ideology. If you've heard the phrase pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right, it has been reinforced through these Horatio Alger stories that kind of provide exemplary text for how people should live their lives in trying to achieve the American dream. And the idea is that you can come from poverty if you work really hard and you just keep your head down and you're obedient. Eventually you're going to get a break, and that break is going to lead to advancement. You can kind of work your way up the ladder. And that's exactly what the protagonists in Horatio Alger stories achieved. Now, of course, what makes it ideological is the fact that it kind of reduces it to a formula. So that's to say, well, if you are still poor, it's because you're not working hard enough, or perhaps you just need to wait a little longer for your break to come. And of course, we know that this isn't going to work for everyone, but it's a myth that sort of circulates in American and capitalist society. So we'll kind of come back to those Horatio Alger stories. But it is an example of how ideology gets perpetrated through literary text. Of course, it also gets perpetrated through political rhetoric, through religious texts, through religious rituals, through the media, through our educational system. And so we're constantly, throughout our lives, bombarded with all these ideological values that eventually we kind of take on and absorb. And of course we participate in it too, and this participation is maintained through the production of text, etc., through representations, and then of course through our reception of that. Now, in his writing, Marx talked about the camera obscura, which translates as a darkened chamber. It was a device that eventually led to development in photography and eventually cinema, where we have a small darkened box that has a hole for light that's emitted, and when you look through the box, what you see is an inversion of the object that you're looking at. And so Marx is using this as a metaphor. That's the key concept here, is a metaphor for ideology or for class relations, where if we look through the camera obscura, we can get an accurate picture of reality versus the distorted version of reality that ideology gives us. And so it's a way of saying that, yes, we encounter these things like the Horatio Alger stories or bootstrap ideology as one way to view the world, but of course this is a distorted view, and if we look through the camera obscura, we can get an accurate presentation of what reality is and how ideology flips that image on its head. All right, some of the key principles in Marxist theory. One is attention to the material conditions and critical engagement is essential for positive social change. And so Marxist theory, sociologically speaking, is going to be a social conflict theory. So it looks at the ways in which different social classes are in conflict with one another and how this can lead to social change. And of course, the idea here is that in Marxist theory, the enemy is not so much conflict but complacency. And so it begins with the acknowledgement that there are gross economic inequalities that exist in a capitalist system, that wealth can be very highly concentrated in a few, and that many in society can suffer as a result of that. We can also look at the ways in which we begin to value commodities over human relationships. And one easy example for us to see this is in the way that we associate social meaning to brands of clothing. So your shirt, for example, is not just something that someone has produced, so that's the labor, as well as something that has an inherent value that provides warmth and protection for you, but it somehow is a statement about your social class. So you can be cool if you wear certain social brands of clothing, right? You become cool or popular, you fit in with a certain social group by how you dress. And of course, that has nothing to do with the inherent value of clothing, but it's just something that we socially ascribe meaning on to clothing. This can result in what Marx calls commodity fetishism. So this is the belief that material objects are not simply equitable to their labor plus practical use. So for example, somebody worked hard to make my shirt, and it certainly has a practical value to me, but it's superseded by some inherent magical value. And what this means is that we start to believe that buying things, objects, commodities can make us happy, right? It's the happiness factor, that through consumption or through buying, we can somehow be happy. And that's commodity fetishism, right? We start to value commodities more than human relationships. Also key to this process is the idea of reification. And reification is displacing a relationship of production and consumption to an abstraction. In the capitalist system, of course, we refer to this as capital, so money. So if we think of, for example, a barter system where if I have a farm with chickens who produce eggs, and my neighbor has a dairy farm that has cows that produce milk, I can take my eggs and exchange those for my neighbor's milk, and we both understand where the eggs, where the milk come from. We appreciate the labor that produced those eggs and milk, and we also are exchanging things that have inherent value, right? Because we get nutrition, we have energy if we consume eggs and consume milk, etc. But if I take my eggs to a store and I receive money for that, so we've displaced that relationship of production and consumption to an abstraction, to capital. It all comes back down to money. And so this allows us to mask or hide behind certain perhaps unethical things that might be done to produce those eggs or that milk, etc. And so if you go to the grocery store, you have no idea who the farmer is that produced that. So we've separated that relationship of production and consumption. Another result is the alienation effect. So this is perhaps most evident in a mass production system where we have a highly detailed division of labor. So with a highly detailed division of labor, a worker might go and do one repetitive task over and over again. And in doing so, he or she has no concept of the final product that that task is eventually going to produce. And so if you have no tie to the end product, you never see the whole process, but instead you do one repetitive task. That results in alienation or sort of estrangement from the entire mode of production. I also might equate this to working for the man, right? Popular saying in our culture, if you go in, you're working for the man, you might be doing menial, banal sort of activities throughout your workday, but you have no real personal connection, no gratification or satisfaction from the work you're doing because it's not tied to, your labor's not tied to the end product, right? You have no control or creativity in your environment, and typically that's what we mean when we say things like working for the man or just a cog in the machine. And that's this idea of alienation of labor. And the result of these things, the result of commodity fetishism, of alienation, reification, is that we as a society tend to value commodities more than human relationships and that relationship between production and consumption. Second key principle, that traditional social structures of classes are built upon the oppression of workers. So it's true in a capitalist society that favors inequality, that wealth is going to be concentrated into a few people, and that extreme wealth is really only possible through exploitation of others, of labor, and also of poverty. So just being aware is really the first step in a Marxist interpretation. Third key principle is that class conflict is inevitable. And this is a line from Marx's work, the idea that there's always going to exist conflict. And I believe that that's a good thing, because conflict can lead to social change. It can lead to an assessment of the ethics of modes of production, of the division of labor, of the remuneration for labor, etc. And so as long as there's conflict, there's a potential for change. Complacency is really the enemy. When we finally just settle into the status quo and say, these aren't ideological, but this is the way it should be, this is the way it is, this is natural, right? And this is exactly the concept of hegemony. So powerful social groups, the aristocracy or the bourgeoisie, those who have some domination or control over the working class, they might want to naturalize their positions and their authority. And so this is done through discourse or hegemony. And hegemony makes the status quo seem very natural and unchangeable. The aristocracy or the bourgeoisie might feel that they have the right to power. Conversely, the proletariat feel like they accept their conditions as being inevitable and feel like they deserve them. So it helps to reinforce the status quo. The fourth key principle is that production and consumption of texts reflect class ideologies. So if we look past the past few centuries, we can see that primarily the bourgeoisie, their interests have been reflected in text. And this is due in part to the fact that the middle class might have more education, more leisure time, more interest in reading versus the working class. And the middle class are greater in number than the aristocracy, so they present the best possible market for the production of texts. And of course their interests are going to be reflected through those texts, or else they wouldn't want to read through them. If we also look at the traditional canon, the old adage was that the canon consisted of dead white men, and that's not so much the case anymore. The canon is being opened up to different perspectives, points of view, etc. But it's true that we could add from a Marxist perspective that the traditional canon is also primarily focused in the interests of the middle or upper class. And these texts can certainly maintain the status quo, or they might also offer opportunities to reevaluate these ideologies and change the status quo. Now you might be wondering, these are great ideas, Professor Matt, but how do I put them into my analysis of literature? And so I'm going to talk about some really basic ways that we can start to apply Marxist concepts or analysis to literature. And to begin with, really analyzing the class identity of our characters. So do we have characters who come from the upper class? We can even tease that out a bit more. Are they upper uppers? Do they come from old money or the idle rich, right? Have they inherited their wealth? Or are they lower uppers? Have they worked hard? Have they risen from the middle class to the upper class society, right? Or do we have middle class characters? Do we have working class characters? So we start to analyze and figure out who our characters are and what social class they fit into. Then we can start to think about how their socioeconomic status or their conditions account for the attitudes, actions, hopes, fears, goals, desires that they have. So in what way are their goals, their desires, their actions informed by their social status, socioeconomic status? And to what degree are these characters products of their socioeconomic status? It could work a variety of different ways. Perhaps, if you have an aristocratic or an upper class character, they might feel empowered by their social status. Conversely, if you have a working class character or a character who's coming from poverty, perhaps they feel trapped in their socioeconomic conditions. Perhaps there's a cycle of poverty or a working class cycle of just living paycheck to paycheck, hand to mouth, and they're working hard, but they haven't gotten a break. They're not able to go beyond their social class. And you can also look at how class conflict plays out in a text. So do you have working class characters who are in conflict with upper class, or working in middle class or middle class and upper class? So we have a variety of different ways that this conflict might play out. So beginning to pay attention to how social class affects our characters. Of course, this might relate to themes. You could talk about how social class could be a theme in the text as well. And so these are some very basic ways that we can start to apply a Marxist theory to the literature that we're reading. And finally, here's a few sources that you can check out, sources that I've used to help create this lecture, and certainly they might help you if you're struggling with insomnia at night. So until next time, this is Professor Matt signing off.